auf Englisch und auf Band. Okay, so we are in the process of discussing theories of human decision making, which is, of course, if you are psychologists, an interesting field, because after all, humans make decisions every day. And it's, of course, interesting to think about how humans make decisions. And as we discussed previously, how humans make decisions is, of course, also of great interest to economists, because basically from understanding how an individual makes decisions, of course, it can be inferred on an aggregate level how many humans and hence whole societies behave in markets, so how people make decisions and how this then results in the economy happening. Yeah, please make sure you sign in. So the last time we talked about this before Easter, we basically went over everything leading up to expected utility, essentially. So we talked about deterministic choice theories in behavioral economics, or you can also call it decision psychology, whatever you want to call it. And so far we dealt with deterministic decisions. So the idea was something along these lines. People make choices, let's say, between apples and oranges, and then there are these little symbols that indicate preference relationships, so they prefer that over that. But if they decide for this or that, then they get that. There was a little bit an idea of a utility function, so that not every value, if you talk about monetary value, has the same marginal utility for everyone. So if you're poor, then getting an extra 1,000 euros might be highly preferred. If you're very rich, then 1,000 euros are, as you remember from the 90s, peanuts. Essentially this is what we've discussed. So there's this notion of utility. Some of you might be able to go back between utility and preferences. So from a utility function, you might be able to read out the preferences. And then there was this notion of a concave utility function, which we will talk about much more today. There is this notation for preference relationships, and the whole thing in economy was focused on kind of building mathematical models of decision making, and a lot of them being more in kind of living more in the theoretical world, and also trying to establish certain equivalence relationships, but in the theoretical world, without necessarily claiming that these are useful models for humans. However, they are still useful to know for psychologists, because in a way they, although not explicitly develop psychological theories, of course they also make some quite strong claims about how humans make decisions, if you then use them to explain market behavior. And of course psychologists should know about them, and then if they don't like them, present something better. So and that's what they do. So the big topic then for today, and maybe the next session, expected utility theory, is quite a big topic in behavioral economics, or the psychology of decision making. Before we start with expected utility theory, any questions that we should discuss? Anything that you feel you really need to clarify now before we go on? No? Good. So, expected utility theory. expected utility theory is really kind of the central thing for behavioral economics, for neuroeconomics. It dates back to the 50s mainly, so the 1950s, and it's kind of this theory where a whole field has arranged itself around. So if you look at standard neuroeconomics studies from the early 2000 to 2010 or so, a lot of them, if they were not about perceptual decision making, they were strongly related to expected utility theory. If you look into the psychology of decision making, going back to Kahneman and Tversky in the 70s, for which they later also get the Nobel Prize, this is basically related. So their prospect theory is fairly closely related to expected utility theory. So it's important. It's a theoretical construct that if you want to talk about how humans make decisions, it's something that people talk about and will know about. And then even if you think it's crap and it doesn't make any sense from a psychological perspective or a neuroscientific perspective, you still have to deal with it, because you have to, in a way, show that whatever you have in mind is better, or at least in somehow, or at least you might at least be required to explain how it relates to expected utility theory. So that's important. So the main difference, as you might already infer from what you see on this slide, is that expected utility theory doesn't deal with, or let's say it only deals with deterministic decision outcomes as a special case. It's more general than early choice theories in the sense that the outcomes of decisions follow a choice probabilistically in expected utility, and also prospect theory, which is a later modification of expected utility, if you want. Of course, a deterministic outcome is also a probabilistic outcome, in the sense that if a certain outcome has the probability 1 to follow from your choice, then of course it's both probabilistic but also deterministic. So it's kind of, yeah, like I said, deterministic decision outcomes are special cases of probabilistic decision outcomes. So to make this fairly explicit, the standard thing for what the decision theories that we discussed previously were of this, the standard decision problems were of this kind of form. So do you want to choose good A or good B? So do you want an apple or an orange? And if you say you want an apple, you get an apple. Now, expected utility theory is based on decisions about what a lot of people call lottery. Sometimes you also call them prospects. You can also call them probability distributions. The most common expected utility theory choice problem is something like this. So you have two options, A or B. In your choice option A, what you get is, with a probability of 0.5, you get $90, and with a probability of 0.5, you get 10. So do you want to choose this lottery, or do you want to choose the lottery B, where you have a 90% probability to win 50 and a 10% probability to win 10? So two things about this. Of course, these lottery choices are models. So so we will discuss them usually with monetary outcomes and associated probabilities. Of course, you can think of this as a model for you can view money as some kind of an equivalent for other outcomes. So, for example, I have to choose between these two seminars, and maybe I learn more. So there's a certain probability that I learn this much in this seminar, and a probability that I don't learn anything or it's horribly boring in this seminar. And then you have another seminar. And the idea is when focusing on these lotteries, that you can basically express monetary equivalence to things like how much knowledge you gain in a seminar, how worthwhile it is to eat this food versus this food, and so on. So it's that the fact that we will talk about these lotteries with monetary outcomes, it's a model, right? But it's a model that is heavily used, and a lot of research is actually done directly on these lottery choices. So then if I ask you which one of the lotteries would you prefer, what would you now do if you have to decide?
The right one.
The right one? So it's a A or B? That's B. Why would you choose B?
Because a very high probability to get $50.
Yeah. And the thing that I always, when I first learned about that these kind of lotteries are kind of the decision problems that people deal with, I was always like, well, you just compute the expected value and then you know what you want to do. And in a way, that is also what this whole thing is about. But when people do deal with these lotteries in behavioral economics, and we will see a fairly explicit example for this later on, the main message is there is no right or wrong answer. It depends on your utility, and we try to actually work on this, work this out a little bit. It has to do with your risk seeking or risk aversive behavior. So there's more to the whole thing that then you might at this point actually assume, but in a way that is also nice. So it's not like there's just the mathematics, you just need to compute it, but there's a lot of also kind of psychology, if you want, to these lottery choices. So before we actually go in that, some nomenclature about the whole thing. So as you figured now in expected utility theory, choices are between these lotteries where whatever you choose, what you then get or the outcome of your decision is still uncertain. So these kind of probabilistic choices are decisions under uncertainty, and there's a specific nomenclature actually. And these kind of choices between lotteries where you know the probabilities and the outcomes with high precision. So where somebody tells you there's a 0.5 probability to win $90 and 0.5 probability to win 10 if you choose A, and or if you choose B, you get for certain $50. These are referred to as decisions under risk. And this is just how behavioral economists or decision psychologists then talk about these things. Because they also call something decisions under uncertainty. And by decisions under uncertainty, they mean that the decision maker, the MS decision maker, knows probabilities and or outcomes only vaguely. Yeah? So this is just how really behavioral economists, so I'm always thinking about the people that I worked with at the MPI from 2012 to 2014 talk about it. I would say, okay, if you have if there are some probabilities involved, that's decision making under uncertainty, It's just uncertain what you get. But they would say, no, this is under risk because the probabilities are known. And then if you don't know the probabilities, that's an uncertainty. In the end, I mean, you can it's kind of a meta problem then. So you don't know the probabilities, but maybe you have some probabilities about these probabilities, what they might be, and so on. So this is pure scientific nomenclature in a specific field of science, namely behavioral economics. But it's also not unhelpful to be specific about these scenarios, because these decisions under risk are, of course, if you think in terms of the real world application, they are also a little bit rare, right? So it's not really the case that somebody can tell you for sure the probability, if you study psychology, to get a good job versus a bad job compared to if you study, I don't know, math or something. So, like I said, these lotteries with, in this case, precise probabilities, these are models of things. And a more realistic thing, but with some vaguely specified probabilities, might be this. Yeah. And the important thing is what we will talk about, namely expected utility and prospect theory in the following. They apply to decisions under risk. The case, those choice scenarios where probabilities and outcomes are known with certainty, but what the result of a choice is still uncertain because it's depending on these lotteries. Yeah, of course, one could do everything different and say, okay, that's not interesting because that's not real life. We want to do something like this, sure, but then we wouldn't be talking about expected utility theory. Yeah, so I'm trying to explain the expected utility theory, and there we're dealing with these choice problems where probabilities and outcomes are precisely known. Questions about this so far? Have you seen these lottery choices somewhere? Yeah, in which context? You not?
Social psychology.
Social psychology. What was the context there? So can you tell me?
I think heuristics influence decision making.
Okay, and that was in social psychology. So
Yes.
What was the social influence?
I can't even remember that much.
Okay.
I remember seeing these choices. I remember seeing the Asian disease problem in this context as well.
Okay. Any other? Anyone else?
You also planning experiments and that kind of stuff. For example, if people are confronted with that or other kind of things, maybe they can feel a bit unsure. That's why they may take more risks or something similar.
Yeah. So this is, I think, these are scenarios that sound familiar. So psychologists are often also then interested in figuring out how these kind of decisions under risk are affected by other psychological factors, either, for example, advice by some other people or by kind of more effective things like priming. So they are being used in psychology research. Yeah, so there have been also actually by the MPI people, as you brought up heuristics, so Gerd Gigerenzer and then his, how do you call it? The guy who follows him, Ralf Hertwig, they are a lot into heuristics, which are kind of simple rules where you don't need any math. Essentially, that's what they mean by heuristics, and they have done some work, especially Ralf, to also relate decision making on these lottery choices to real life risk taking. So of course it's something different whether I sit in an experiment run by some undergraduate psychology and decide, okay, I'm taking some risk here, I take the lottery where I have a low probability of a high outcome, but I take it anywhere because I'm sitting here in this psychology building, whether I want to do a bungee jump or not. these are kind of different risks, and what they found in their work is that kind of real-life risk-taking, which of course also refers to acquiring insurance or doing savings for your pensions, so pension savings and so on. These kind of real-life risky decisions versus these kind of laboratory risky decisions, the results not necessarily correlate. Yeah? So it's a model. The question is how good. So using these kind of lottery choices as in risk experiments, the question is how good of a model of real life things it is. Maybe it's not the best model. However, there's another reason why these things are interested in that from the AI perspective in creating agents that behave well under uncertain outcomes. So this is, even if one says, okay, lottery choices in human psychology experiments might not really reflect the risk-taking behavior of humans, expected utility theory is still interesting because it can be used to optimize the decision-making under uncertainty behavior of AI agents. Good. We now have to talk about the difference between expected utility and expected value maximization. So first, the question is, of course, what's the expected value of a lottery and what is its meaning? So does any one of you have a definition of expected values on their mind? So what would you say if somebody asks you what's the expected value of a lottery here? What do you think? Any ideas?
The mean, maybe?
Yeah, the mean. But so, for example, if you have a lottery like this here, how would you compute the mean?
Like the mean under the condition that there are infinite number of trials?
Okay, so yeah,
so
yeah,
the average of an infinite number of trials.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, and this is actually what we will get to. Yeah, so what you describe is kind of the frequentist interpretation of an expected value, which we will also see in a second, and that's actually fairly important because these two things are two different things. So an expected value is something that is a theoretical quantity which you can assign to a random variable. In this case, the random variable, which is a mathematical model for some uncertain real-life thing, this random variable can, for example, here in lottery A, can take on the value 90 with a probability of 0.5 and the value 10 with a probability of 0.5. The expected value of this is then defined as the sum of the values that the random variable can take, so xi, and x here would be 90 and 10, and multiplied by the probability for it to take on this specific value, so the probability of the random variable being 90 or 10, which was 0.5, and this is how you can compute an expected value from a probability distribution. Yeah. So if you think of your undergrad statistics where you might have encountered the Gaussian probability distribution, you might know that the expected value of a Gaussian probability distribution is the same as its expectation parameter. So maybe you call it the mean, but it's actually fairly important that you try to dissociate empirical means that you compute on data versus expected values which you compute on random variables and essentially probabilistic models. So these are two different things, but of course the interpretation is, and this is what you said, what is noted here. So the interpretation of an expected value is if I draw from this probability distribution or from this random variable many times and compute the mean, so essentially do many trials until infinity, then my cumulative arithmetic mean will converge to the expected value. And I have an example for that on the next slide. First, let's briefly compute the expected values of lottery A and B. So this little formula says you should multiply the probability for each outcome with the outcome and then sum over it. Yeah. So here you should do 0.5 times 90, which is 45. 0.5 times 10, which is 5, and then add the two, and then you get the expected value of 50 here. And for this one, you should multiply 0.9 with 50, and you get 45, and 0.1 times 10, which is 1, and you get 46. So I think you actually preferred this one, right? When I asked you, and if that was the same problem, I hope it was. This means, in a way, that you didn't strive for maximizing your expected value. But of course, this always depends a lot of how you interpret these probabilities and outcomes. And it definitely makes a lot of sense what you, from my perspective, also, I would choose the same thing if I would only play this game once. If I would play this game many times, then I might think different. So, yeah, we had this, sorry. It's just the same slide. So this shows this interpretation of expected values and its relationship to arithmetic means. So here the lottery A has two outcomes, 10 and 90, and there's a 50% chance that 90 or 10 is sampled. And if you then look over trials, so trials are here on the x-axis, you see that it comes out 10 and 90, and it's sometimes there's a little bit of a row of coming out 10, but overall it switches a lot. And if you compute let's look at the other one. Here you have a 90% of it coming out 50 and only 10% coming out 10. So you see that most of the time it comes out 50. Not too surprising. Now, if you look at the mean, so blue is the mean of this. So then in the beginning, you start out with twice only 10. So you start up with a fairly low mean, but then you average more and more of these individual trials here. And you see if you average more and more on those, the cumulative average gets closer and closer to the expected value. The same thing essentially for the lottery B starts out with a lot of 50s. So not originally, but in this trial sequence, the cumulative average, so averaging over all the trials up to the 20th trial or so, is 50. But then, of course, sometimes you get the 10, and if you do that many times, then in the end, you're fairly close to the expected value. So one important thing to note about this, although this might seem fairly straightforward to you, is that this rests on what is known the frequentist interpretation of probabilities. So it kind of assumes that probabilities describe long-range averages, as we see here. There is, of course, also an interpretation of probabilities that, so for example, so it's not a spoiler because I haven't watched it, but the probability that, I don't know, Jamie Lannister dies today. So, or any one of these people who sat around near the fireplace last week, the probability that some of them die, you can also talk about, but of course there will only be like 4 episodes left, and there will not be these averages of kind of that they make again and again the 4th or the 3rd episode, and you can somehow average over that. So the talking about probabilities and probabilities and the calculus of probabilities can also be used for these kind of subjective things. what I was trying to stress here is that the thinking in expected utility theory about probabilities is in this frequentist setting where you can sample these things, and they describe some long-range probabilities. So that's the expected value. Questions about this? No. Yeah.
Just a little question. Later on, we'll tackle on behavioral economics, right? Because I was just thinking, for example, in this case, just the value of the expected winning value of the lottery is taken into consideration. But for example, other things like adrenaline level of the person, or like those things are completely left out.
Yeah.
For example, a lot of people also play lottery and that kind of stuff because they want to feel something, and not exactly because they want just to win. But also like the risk.
Yeah, actually what we will talk mainly about is understanding expected utility theory, okay. But you are right in saying that a lot of research is being done to figure out what kind of factors affect these kind of things. But if you really look into the literature, it's not straightforward. One of the reasons that there's a lot of confusion in the literature about this in general, I think, is also that sometimes it's not really clear whether the people who do when they do certain things, whether they really get the idea of expected utility theory. So this is why I'm trying to focus on that. But you're right, there's a lot of research on that, and of course there's also a lot of neuroscience trying to, for example, find the brain region that reflects the probabilities and the brain region that reflects the outcomes. This kind of research is being done. It's not my favorite research, so this is why I'm a little bit silent on that. But there's much more to actually understand about expected utility theory. Any other things? Yep.
So the concept of utility, actually, did it arise from the concept of like trade and economics? I heard that in the context that like people trade things and they generate utils, like this is the unit of utility in some way. So it sounds a bit familiar. Is it the same one, the same concept?
Yeah, I mean, like we so it. This is actually the slide that we also saw last year. So it's coming definitely from economics, and the way it's being used here is kind of this as a nonlinear, from my perspective, a nonlinear transformation of some outcome. Yeah? So the thing is, we can say 90 euros, but the utility or the subjective gain that you or me or someone else has from the same objective monetary value might differ, and that's the utility that someone derives from it. So the main thing is here that it's dependent on the decision maker. Yeah? So that's, and we actually so far we've only seen expected value maximization. So here this was not utility, this was not expected utility maximization. Here we just computed expected values and didn't talk about utilities yet, but now we will do. Yeah. So far we just did expected value theory, if you want, and now we get to expected utility theory, because that builds on expected value maximization. So the idea is that that people not necessarily maximize the expected value in these decisions under risk, but their expected utility. And this utility, that of course then depends on their utility function, so how they transform the possible outcomes of their choices to their subjective utility. And this then influences their choice in the sense that they're trying to maximize their personal utility. And what we've seen previously on this is that that these utility functions are often assumed to be concave, and we will talk much more about this concavity of utility functions. because it's a way, at least in expected utility theory, to model risk aversion. But we will get to that. So what we've seen on the previous slide was expected utility maximization, expected value maximization. Now we're dealing with expected utility. And the crucial thing about expected utility, like I said, is that there is a utility function which is applied to the outcome. Yeah. So the expected utility from some lottery then depends on the outcomes, on the probability of the outcomes, and on the utility function that somebody uses to transform the expected outcomes. The utility function, remember how I last time explained how to write down functions. The utility function takes a value in the outcome space of the lottery, so for example 90 or 10, and maps that onto a real value, and this real value is then called u of x, and it's commonly assumed that these are monotonic. However, this also doesn't need to be, but for this, where we start out now, we assume that it's monotonic in the sense that if the real value or the outcome value in such a lottery is larger than some other value, so if, for example, 90 larger than 10, then the utility of 90 is at least as large as the utility of 10. Yeah. You can, of course, also relax that, but then it gets fairly weird. So if you're talking about decision makers who have a high utility for getting 10 euros and a really low utility for getting 90 euros, it's kind of already going against a lot of rational thinking. And what expected utility theory, what's of course behind this, is that it's a rational decision maker. Yeah. So if you, of course, you can say, yeah, but people are not rational, or fine. But the expected utility theory framework assumes rational decision makers, so that they at least are monotonic in their utilities. Yeah.
Is there a possibility to actually eliminate subjects from a certain experiment if you can actually see based on the data that they didn't actually understand something?
Well, yeah, so if you're talking about doing experiments with these kind of things, I think it's always a big, so there are two things. So sometimes people do these kind of lottery choice experiments with, so I never know, I'm never quite sure what this is about. So first of all, I think it's, so one thing is that you first, ideally, if you show these things to, so these lottery choices to participants, you have two options. Either you don't explain to them anything, so you just say, oh, make your choices, and then you don't even know whether they have any understanding of what probabilities are, whether they can actually multiply numbers and sum them and so on, so you don't know anything. And then you can, of course, write a psychological theory about why this is, and that it would be better to represent probabilities by frequencies and so on, and talk about that. Or you can, before you do the experiment with them, educate them and explain to them how to compute expected values and so on, and then not explain them in the end fully what you want, and then you have fairly high control, but in a way you already gave away a lot of your stuff. So personally, so like you said, so the way when we do experiments that go a little bit in this direction, so we rarely do these kind of lottery choices where people just, or essentially need to compute something and have some interpretation of probability. So But in general, what we always assume and what we base experiments in is that people try to make an effort and try to win. So although most of the time we don't explicitly give them probabilities and monetary values to deal with, but we commonly make the assumption that people try to win in these kind of experiments. Of course, this is also an assumption. Yeah? And yes, you could, of course, exclude participants who you thought they didn't get the task, but then maybe explain the task, or maybe this was not the experiment that you wanted to do. So I feel it's a little bit weird to just throw these lottery choices onto people and see what happens, because this, of course, is highly dependent on their education. I mean, it's probability, it's a little bit abstract. Thing is, this is expected utility theory, which is the theoretical framework, and it's a mathematical framework with certain theorems that we will get to, which was not necessarily designed as a model for human decision making, but has been or is heavily used in this context, which is a little bit weird. Yeah? But on the other hand, so you in the end you want a kind of formalized model for psychology also, because you want to make a quantitative prediction. So you have to deal with something like this. But so the best we always try to do is to for things that people should know, where we build agents. Our models we call of human decision making we call agents. So where we build agents that we try to control that what we tell the agent when we let them do the task is the same thing that we tell the human participants when we let them do the task. So. Good. So the important thing, and maybe then after that we take a brief break because I need a break. The important thing is that in contrast to the expected value, there's this transformation of the outcomes, which is not necessarily the identity function, so it's not necessarily just, again, the outcome, but it's transforming this. And the question is now, why and what does it do? And one major thing about this is that this effect that we've seen before, so that you say, okay, here's a high probability that I get 50, and okay, there I would have the probability to get 100, but the probability is not that high. This can be explained by concave utility functions. And how that works, this is what I want to explain after the break, because it's kind of an important thing in expected utility, so that you can model risk aversion with concave utility functions, which, if you first hear it, sounds fancy, and it's also fairly easy to say, but it's not necessarily that easy to understand. So that's what I want to clarify then in the next hour. But now I need a break.